Castro has died. The father of the Cuban Revolution has passed away, aged 90. Campaigning stops. It's all down to the voters now, as France prepares to decide who will lead the centre-right in next year's presidential elections. And the suspects in the December 1st foiled French terror plot have been detained and charged. Thanks for joining us live from Paris this Saturday morning. I'm Hala Mohieddin. We begin with that breaking news from Havana. Fidel Castro, the revolutionary icon, has died aged 90. His brother Raul, the current Cuban leader, confirmed the news on state television. William Hildebrandt has more now on this iconic leader.
January 1959, and Fidel Castro is carried through the streets by jubilant crowds in Havana. The young leftist guerrilla had just overthrown the pro-American regime, forcing the dictator General Batista to flee the country. Alongside the revolutionary icon Che Guevara, Castro seized power and wouldn't relinquish it for almost 50 years. El Comandante, as he styled himself, came to symbolize Cuba throughout the second half of the 20th century. At a time when the Cold War was dividing the world, Castro was propped up by the Soviet Union. Then John F. Kennedy arrived in the White House in 1961. The US president authorized the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion that same year. Launched by the CIA, 1,500 Cubans left Miami with the intention of overthrowing Castro. They failed completely. The Cuban people supported Castro, their leader who would unstintingly defy the United States. A furious Washington imposed an economic embargo on Cuba, but Castro didn't give in. In 1962, allied with the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev, Castro was at the center of what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Moscow considered deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the US coast. The move angered Washington and a tense standoff ensued. For a few days, the world teetered on the brink of a Third World War until Khrushchev backed down and the embargo continued. Forever wearing his olive-green uniform, seemingly unassailable, Castro saw 10 US presidents come and go. The leftist firebrand was one of the world's longest-serving leaders, surviving numerous assassination attempts and the fall of the Soviet Union. However, he remained diplomatically isolated, and Castro's 1995 visit to Paris was controversial. It's thought up to 1 million people fled his repressive authoritarian regime over the years. The then French President François Mitterrand welcomed him in what was officially a private visit, but was one of the only Western leaders to do so. Accused by his critics of being a dictator, it was an image Castro always fought against, brushing off questions of human rights and political prisoners in Cuba.
There were many political prisoners under the old regime. As time passed, we were the ones putting members of the former regime in prison when they tried to fight the revolution with terrorist attacks or acts of sabotage against the country.
A brilliant orator, Castro could talk at length, sometimes for hours on end. He was also a man to whom image meant everything. In 1998, he invited Pope John Paul II to Cuba, well aware that the head of the Catholic Church was extremely popular on the island. Even as the elderly Castro grew weaker and more feeble, he was reluctant to loosen his grip on power. He was stricken in 2006 by an undisclosed illness that some suggested was pancreatic cancer. His illness kept him from public view for much of his last years in office, and in February 2009 he formally handed the presidency over to his brother Raul. Despite no longer being in power, Castro wouldn't retire from public life entirely, with Cuban dailies regularly publishing articles of his thoughts on current affairs.
As will Hildebrandt and Luke Schregel with that report. Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader who defied 5 decades of US efforts to topple him, has passed away at the age of 90.